Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Take a moment to breathe, quiet your mind, and let this slow storytelling keep you company. Whether you're winding down for sleep or simply finding calm while working, driving, cooking, showering, or with headphones on, if you appreciate this kind of long-form, fact-driven exploration, humble inquiry that admits we don't have all the answers, but does its best, please consider liking and subscribing.
Good axe.
It helps more people discover
Good grain,
thoughtful
plentiful.
educational content, and in its own way conquers the world with knowledge. I'd also love to know how you use these stories before bed, while working, or even where you watch from. Share it if you'd like. This channel grows through curious sapiens like you, and if you drift off mid-episode, don't worry. I've placed timestamps in the description so you can pick up right where you left off, because every chapter of this story is worth hearing. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Tonight's story begins with a question so fundamental that most of us never think to ask it. What is money? Not the paper in your wallet or the numbers on your screen, but the very idea that some things can stand in for other things, that value can be stored, carried, and exchanged across time and space. The answer takes us back to a world where the first spark of this revolutionary concept flickered to life in the minds of our ancestors. Imagine, if you will, a world without money. No coins, no bills, no digital transactions. Just people with needs and skills, scattered across landscapes where survival depended on what you could make, grow, hunt, or gather with your own hands. This was not a world of poverty, but a world of direct relationship between human effort and human need. Yet within this simplicity lay the seeds of something that would reshape civilization itself. The story of money is not the story of greed or materialism, though those would come later. It is the story of human ingenuity confronting a fundamental problem. How do you get what you need when what you have is not what others want? How do you store the value of your work beyond the moment? How do you coordinate the efforts of strangers across vast distances? These questions, pressing and practical, would give birth to one of humanity's most profound innovations. But we must begin at the beginning, in those long millennia before anyone had conceived of currency, when the first humans began to realize that cooperation could multiply their individual efforts beyond anything they could achieve alone. This is the story of the first money, but more than that, it is the story of how humans learned to trust abstractions, to believe in shared fictions that would become more powerful than any physical force. The earliest humans lived in small bands, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals bound together by kinship and necessity. Within these groups, sharing was not generosity but survival. When one person found honey, everyone ate honey. When another brought down game, the meat was distributed according to need and relationship. There was no accounting, no ledger of debts and credits. The band was a single organism, and resources flowed through it like blood through a body. Yet even in these intimate communities, something like exchange was already stirring. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa reveals that humans were moving materials across surprising distances more than 100,000 years ago. Obsidian from volcanic sources appears in tools hundreds of kilometers away. Shells from coastal areas turn up deep inland. Red ochre, prized for body painting and ritual use, traveled even farther. This movement of materials tells us something profound about our ancestors. They were not isolated groups scratching out subsistence in their immediate surroundings. They were connected by invisible threads of relationship and exchange that spanned vast territories. But how did this work? How did a piece of volcanic glass journey from its source to a toolmaker's hands across hundreds of kilometers of wilderness? The answer lies in understanding that even the simplest human societies were never truly simple. Within each band, individuals had different skills, different knowledge, different access to resources. One person might be particularly skilled at knapping stone tools. Another might know the secret locations where the best materials could be found. Still another might have relationships with distant groups, built through kinship, marriage, or shared experience. When neighboring bands encountered one another, these individual specializations created opportunities. The skilled toolmaker could offer finished implements in exchange for raw materials. The person with geographic knowledge could guide others to valuable sources in return for a share of what was gathered. These exchanges were not commerce as we know it, but they contained the essential logic that would eventually flower into complex economic systems. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies have observed these patterns in action. Among the Kung people of the Kalahari, a complex system called Hexaro governs the exchange of gifts across vast networks of relationships. A person in one area might give an ostrich shell necklace to a distant relative, not expecting immediate return, but knowing that at some future time, in some future season of scarcity, they could travel to that person's territory and expect hospitality, food, and support. This is not trade in the modern sense, but it contains something essential that modern trade would inherit. The recognition that value can be deferred, that giving now can create obligations that persist across time and space. The necklace becomes more than ornament. It becomes a token of relationship, a physical reminder of invisible bonds that might be called upon when need arises. But there was a problem with this system, beautiful as it was. It worked well within the intimate scale of bands and tribes, where everyone knew everyone, where relationships were thick with history and kinship. But as human populations grew and spread, as groups began to encounter strangers with whom they shared no bonds of blood or marriage, these intimate systems of reciprocity began to strain. How do you trust a stranger? How do you ensure that value given will be value received when you may never see the other person again? How do you compare the worth of your finely crafted spear point against their carefully prepared hide when you have no shared standards, no common measure? These challenges became more pressing as humans began to settle into larger, more permanent communities. The agricultural revolution, which began independently in several parts of the world around 10,000 years ago, created new possibilities and new problems. Farmers could produce surpluses, more food than they could eat, but they also became tied to specific places. They could not simply move on when relationships soured or when local resources were exhausted. The first farming villages were experiments in cooperation on a scale humanity had never attempted. Hundreds of people, many of them strangers or distant relations, had to coordinate their efforts, share resources, and resolve disputes. The intimate gift economies that had worked in small bands could not scale to these larger communities. Something new was needed. At first, The solutions were extensions of older patterns. Village elders might oversee the distribution of surplus grain, allocating it according to need, relationship, and contribution. Skilled craftspeople might be supported by the community in exchange for their specialized services. Festivals and feasts provided occasions for redistribution, where the wealth of good harvests was shared and social bonds were reinforced through collective celebration. But even these adaptations had their limits. What happened when one village had surplus grain but needed tools, while another village had skilled metal workers but had suffered a poor harvest? How could value be moved between communities that might be separated by days or weeks of travel? How could the timing of different needs and surpluses be coordinated? The answer emerged slowly through countless small innovations and adaptations. In Mesopotamia, where some of the world's first cities arose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, clay tablets from around 5,000 years ago record the beginnings of what we might recognize as economic thinking. These tablets document not just what was stored in temple granaries, but also what was owed to whom, what had been promised in future deliveries, what rates of exchange had been established between different goods. The cuneiform script itself, one of humanity's earliest writing systems, was largely developed to solve economic problems. How do you keep track of complex transactions involving multiple parties, different goods, and deferred payments? How do you record agreements that might not be fulfilled for months or years? Writing, that fundamental human technology, was born from the need to make invisible relationships visible, to give permanent form to temporary agreements. But the real breakthrough came with the recognition that certain objects could serve as universal measures of value, not because they were inherently valuable, but because everyone agreed they were valuable. This was perhaps the most abstract leap our ancestors ever made, requiring them to believe in something that existed primarily in their collective imagination. The first such objects were often things that had practical value in themselves. Cattle, for instance, served as a measure of wealth in many early agricultural societies. They provided meat, milk, leather, and labor. They could walk themselves to market. They reproduced, creating natural interest on investment. The Latin word for money, pecunia, derives from pecus, meaning cattle, preserving the memory of this ancient standard. Similarly, grain served as both food and currency in many early civilizations. It was universally needed. It could be stored for extended periods. It was divisible into small units, and its value was relatively stable. Temple complexes in ancient Mesopotamia functioned partly as banks, storing grain deposits and making loans of seed grain to farmers. But using cattle or grain as money had obvious problems. Cattle were difficult to transport, could not be divided into small denominations, and might die or become diseased. Grain was bulky, could spoil, and varied in quality. What was needed was something that combined the universal acceptability of these practical currencies with the portability and durability of more abstract tokens. The solution appeared independently in many parts of the world as human societies reached similar levels of complexity and faced similar challenges. In different regions, different materials emerged as preferred media of exchange. Along trade routes, certain goods became standardized, not because of their practical utility, but because of their social acceptance. In West Africa, cowrie shells became a dominant currency. their value based not on any practical use, but on their beauty, rarity, and the social agreement that they represented wealth. In the Pacific Northwest, blankets woven from mountain goat wool served similar functions. In parts of Central Asia, bricks of tea compressed into portable blocks became a standard of value, useful both as currency and as the raw material for an essential beverage. Each of these currencies tells us something about the societies that created them. They reflect local resources, cultural values, and practical constraints. But they also reveal something universal about human nature, our willingness to invest abstract objects with concrete meaning to create shared fictions that become more real than physical reality. The emergence of these standardized media of exchange solved many problems, but it also created new ones. Who decides how many cowrie shells equal one goat? How do you prevent counterfeiting when your currency is a natural product? How do you maintain stable values when supply and demand can fluctuate wildly? These questions would drive the next phase of monetary evolution as human societies began to experiment with more sophisticated forms of value storage and exchange. But that is a story for our next chapter, when we will explore how abstract tokens became standardized weights, how precious metals entered the story, and how the first coins emerged from the forges of ancient kingdoms. For now, we leave our ancestors at a crucial threshold. They had discovered that value could be abstracted, stored, and transferred. They had learned to trust in shared agreements about worth and meaning. They had taken the first steps toward creating the complex economic systems that would eventually span the globe. The leap from practical objects to abstract tokens was not sudden, but it was revolutionary. In the mountains of Anatolia, where copper deposits gleamed in exposed rock faces, smiths began to understand that metal possessed qualities unlike anything that had come before. It could be shaped without losing its essential nature. It could be divided into precise portions. It could be melted down and reformed countless times without degradation. Most importantly, it carried its value in its very substance. Yet even this breakthrough required a conceptual shift that we can barely imagine today. For our ancestors, the idea that a small piece of metal could represent the value of a cow, a season's harvest, or a skilled craftsman's labor was as abstract as any mathematical equation. They had to learn to see past the physical properties of copper, silver, and gold to grasp their symbolic potential. The earliest metal currencies were not coins as we know them, but rough lumps and bars, their value determined by weight rather than form. In the ruins of ancient Troy, archaeologists have uncovered collections of metal fragments, carefully sorted by type and size. These were not the tools of warfare or craft, but the implements of commerce. Each piece had been tested, weighed, and valued according to standards that existed primarily in the minds of those who used them. This system required remarkable trust. When a merchant accepted a piece of silver in exchange for pottery, they were trusting not only that the metal was pure, but that others would recognize its value, that it could be exchanged again in distant markets, that the shared fiction of its worth would persist across time and space. They were betting their livelihood on humanity's collective imagination. The trust was not misplaced. Metal currencies, spread along trade routes with remarkable speed, carried by merchants who recognized their advantages over bulkier alternatives. A trader could carry the value of hundreds of cattle in a small leather pouch. They could divide their wealth into exact portions. They could store value for years without fear of spoilage or decay. But the system was not without its problems. Each transaction required careful weighing and testing. Silver could be mixed with cheaper metals. Gold could be shaved or adulterated. The purity of metal was difficult to verify without sophisticated techniques. Disputes over weight and quality could derail negotiations and destroy relationships. In the workshops of ancient smiths, solutions began to emerge. Craftsmen learned to create ingots of standardized weight and purity, marked with symbols that guaranteed their quality. These marks were the ancestors of what we would call brands today. They represented the reputation of the maker, their promise that the metal met certain standards. The most successful of these early standardizers were often associated with temples or royal courts, institutions whose authority extended beyond local boundaries. A silver bar marked with the symbol of a powerful king carried weight not just in its metal content, but in the political authority that guaranteed its value. The temple of a widely worshipped deity could certify purity with the force of divine sanction. This association between currency and authority would prove crucial to the next phase of monetary evolution. As kingdoms grew larger and more centralized, rulers began to see currency not just as a tool of commerce, but as an instrument of power. The ability to control what counted as money, to determine its purity and weight, to guarantee its acceptance, was the ability to shape the economic life of entire populations. The transition was gradual, but inexorable. What had begun as practical solutions to problems of exchange became mechanisms of state control. The authority to mint currency became a royal prerogative, jealously guarded and carefully regulated. The standardization that had made trade more efficient also made it more dependent on political stability. In the palace workshops of Lydia, a kingdom nestled between the great empires of the ancient world, this evolution reached a crucial turning point. Lydian craftsmen, working with the rich gold deposits of the Pactolus River, began to experiment with techniques that would transform not just local commerce, but the entire structure of economic life. The innovation was both simple and profound. Instead of creating rough ingots whose value had to be determined anew with each transaction, they began to stamp pieces of metal with official marks that guaranteed both weight and purity. These stamps were not just decorative, they were promises, backed by the full authority of the Lydian state. The earliest of these stamped pieces were irregular in shape, more like metal nuggets than the perfect circles we associate with modern coins. But they carried something revolutionary. For the first time in human history, the value of money was determined not by negotiation or testing, but by official certification. A piece of metal became valuable not because of its material properties alone, but because of the social and political authority that guaranteed its worth. The psychological impact of this innovation cannot be overstated. For the first time, ordinary people could engage in complex transactions without specialized knowledge of metallurgy or access to precision scales. A farmer could sell grain to a merchant and receive payment whose value was guaranteed by powers greater than either of them. The democratization of commerce had begun, but the true genius of the Lydian innovation lay not just in standardization, but in the recognition that currency could carry meaning beyond its material value. The images and symbols stamped on these early coins were not random decorations. They were carefully chosen to communicate messages about power, identity, and belonging. A lion's head might represent the strength of the ruling dynasty. The image of a patron deity could invoke divine protection over commercial transactions. Symbols of local pride could create emotional connections that transcended mere economic utility. Those early coins were not just tools of trade, but vessels of culture and identity. The success of Lydian currency created pressures for imitation and innovation across the ancient world. Greek city-states began minting their own coins, each adorned with symbols of local identity. The owl of Athens became synonymous with reliable currency. The turtle of Aegina guaranteed acceptance across Mediterranean trade networks. The Pegasus of Corinth carried value to distant colonies. Each of these currencies represented not just a medium of exchange, but a declaration of independence, a claim to economic sovereignty. The ability to mint one's own coins became a mark of political maturity, a statement that a community had achieved the stability and authority necessary to guarantee value. Yet with this proliferation came new challenges. How do you compare the value of Athenian owls against Corinthian Pegasus? How do you establish exchange rates between currencies backed by different authorities? How do you prevent counterfeiting when successful designs invite imitation? The solutions that emerged would shape economic thinking for millennia to come. Money changers appeared in marketplaces, specializing in the conversion of one currency to another. These early financiers developed sophisticated techniques for testing purity and authenticity. They created the first exchange rate systems, constantly adjusting values based on supply, demand, and political stability. The temples and palaces that had initially guaranteed currency quality found themselves drawn deeper into economic management. They became banks in the modern sense, accepting deposits, making loans, and facilitating complex transactions across vast distances. The religious and political authorities that had created money found themselves transformed by their creation. Trade networks that had once operated through personal relationships and seasonal markets began to evolve into permanent institutions. Merchant houses established branches in distant cities. Commercial codes developed to govern transactions between strangers. The infrastructure of what we would recognize as modern economy began to take shape around the revolutionary concept of standardized currency. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. For the first time in human history, value became truly abstract. A coin was valuable not because of what it was made of, not because of who guaranteed it, but because everyone agreed it was valuable. This collective agreement, this shared fiction, became more powerful than any physical force. The implications rippled outward in ways that the original innovators could never have imagined. If value could be abstracted and standardized, what else could be measured and compared? If trust could be embodied in physical tokens, how might that trust be extended and leveraged? If authority could guarantee the worth of metal, what other promises might it make and keep? These questions would drive the next phase of monetary evolution as human societies began to experiment with credit, debt, and the temporal dimension of economic exchange. But already, in those first stamped coins of ancient Lydia, we can see the outlines of the modern world emerging. The recognition that value is ultimately a social construction, that money is a shared language, that economic systems are built on foundations of collective trust and agreement. The story of early currency is not just about the practical problems of exchange and storage. It is about humanity's growing sophistication in creating and maintaining social institutions. It is about our willingness to believe in abstractions, to trust in systems larger than ourselves, to participate in collective fictions that become more real than physical reality. As we trace this evolution from practical barter to abstract currency, we see our ancestors grappling with questions that remain central to economic life today. How do we establish and maintain trust between strangers? How do we create systems that are both flexible and stable? How do we balance individual needs with collective welfare? How do we manage the tension between innovation and tradition? The answers they developed, encoded in metal and law, in custom and institution, continue to shape our world today. Every transaction we make, every promise we keep or break, every agreement we enter into carries forward the legacy of those first bold experiments in abstraction and trust. The success of these early currencies created ripple effects that no one could have anticipated. As coins spread along trade routes, they carried with them not just economic value, but ideas about fairness, measurement, and social organization. A merchant who had grown accustomed to the precision of Lydian gold suddenly found the informal negotiations of traditional barter crude and unreliable. The standardization that made commerce more efficient also made it more demanding. In the bustling markets of ancient cities, we can imagine the transformation taking place, where once a day's trading might involve lengthy discussions about the relative merits of different goods, heated negotiations over quality and quantity, and complex calculations of seasonal value. Now transactions could be completed with swift precision. A loaf of bread cost 3 copper pieces. A woolen cloak required 2 silver coins. The poetry of negotiation gave way to the mathematics of fixed pricing. Yet this efficiency came with hidden costs. The personal relationships that had once bound trader to customer, the intimate knowledge of local conditions and individual needs, began to dissolve into anonymous exchange. Money made trade faster and more reliable, but it also made it more impersonal. The warmth of human connection cooled into the precision of commercial calculation. Archaeological evidence from ancient marketplaces reveals this transition in subtle ways. Earlier trading sites show evidence of communal gathering spaces, areas designed for extended social interaction alongside commerce. Later sites, dating from the widespread adoption of coinage, show more specialized architecture. Stalls become smaller and more standardized. Storage facilities multiply. The infrastructure of rapid exchange replaces the spaces of leisurely negotiation. But the most profound changes were taking place not in the physical arrangement of markets, but in the mental landscape of those who used them. For the first time in human history, people began to think systematically about value in numerical terms. A sheep was worth 12 coins. A day's labor earned 4. A season's harvest might yield 300. These equations, simple as they seem to us, represented a revolutionary new way of understanding the world. The psychological impact rippled through every aspect of social life. Parents began calculating the cost of raising children not just in emotional terms, but in precise economic ones. Rulers started measuring the wealth of their kingdoms not through vague assessments of abundance, but through careful tallies of monetary reserves. Even religious institutions found themselves drawn into economic calculation as temples became banks and priests became accountants. This quantification of value created new possibilities for planning and coordination. A merchant could calculate exactly how much goods to bring to a distant market. A farmer could determine precisely when it made sense to sell grain versus storing it for later seasons. A craftsman could compare the profitability of different products with mathematical precision. The emergence of money was also the emergence of economic rationality, but rationality brought its own complications. In societies where value had been fluid and contextual, where the worth of goods varied with relationships, seasons, and circumstances, the fixed precision of monetary exchange could feel harsh and alienating. A widow, who once might have relied on community generosity, now faced the cold mathematics of debt and payment. A young person seeking to establish themselves found that traditional apprenticeships were being replaced by wage labor calculated to the smallest coin. The tension between the old ways and the new created social stress that ancient societies struggled to manage. Laws emerged to regulate monetary exchange, to prevent exploitation of the vulnerable, to maintain some vestige of the reciprocal obligations that had once bound communities together. The Code of Hammurabi, one of history's earliest legal documents, devotes extensive attention to regulating interest rates, preventing fraud in weights and measures, and protecting debtors from excessive punishment. These legal innovations reveal how deeply money was changing social relationships. Where informal customs had once governed exchange, formal laws now became necessary. Where personal reputation had guaranteed trustworthiness, institutional mechanisms emerged to enforce contracts. Where community pressure had resolved disputes, professional judges began interpreting standardized codes. The transformation was not uniform across all societies. In Egypt, where the pharaoh's divine authority remained central to social organization, monetary systems developed more slowly and remained more tightly controlled by royal administration. In Greece, where independent city-states competed for commercial advantage, currency innovation proceeded rapidly, with each polis experimenting with different metals, weights, and designs to attract traders. These different approaches to monetary development reflected deeper cultural values and political structures. Societies that emphasized collective welfare and centralized authority tended to maintain more conservative monetary policies, changing slowly and maintaining strict standards. Communities that prized individual enterprise and competitive advantage embraced monetary innovation more readily, accepting the risks that came with experimentation. The competition between different monetary systems created pressures for improvement that drove technological and institutional advancement. Cities that issued reliable, pure coins found their currencies accepted across wider territories. Kingdoms that maintained stable weights and measures attracted more trade. The quality of monetary systems became a form of soft power, extending influence far beyond political boundaries. Along the great trade routes that connected ancient civilizations, certain currencies emerged as preferred media of exchange. Athenian owls became widely accepted across the Mediterranean, not because of Athens's military might, but because of the consistent purity and weight of its silver. Persian derricks gained acceptance along Asian trade routes because of the administrative sophistication of the Persian Empire. These currencies became the first international monies accepted by people who had never seen the cities that minted them. The success of these international currencies created new forms of economic interdependence. A crisis in Athenian silver mines could affect trade relationships across the Mediterranean. Political instability in Persia could disrupt commerce along routes stretching from India to Greece. For the first time, economic events in one region could have rapid and far-reaching consequences in distant areas. This interconnection brought both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Merchants could access larger markets and more diverse goods than ever before. Craftsmen could specialize in products for which they had particular advantages, trusting that currency would allow them to obtain everything else they needed. Consumers gained access to luxury goods and specialized products from across the known world. But the same connections that created these opportunities also transmitted economic shocks with unprecedented speed. A bad harvest in one region could drive up grain prices across an entire trade network. Political conflicts could disrupt currency supplies and create artificial scarcities. The benefits of economic integration came with the costs of economic vulnerability. Ancient societies developed various strategies to manage these new risks. Some maintained reserves of multiple currencies to hedge against instability in any single system. Others established treaties and agreements to ensure stable exchange rates and reliable supplies. Still others invested in developing alternative trade routes to reduce dependence on any single pathway. The institutional innovations that emerged from these challenges laid groundwork for much of what we recognize as modern economic infrastructure. Banking houses established correspondent relationships across vast distances, allowing value to be transferred without physically moving coins. Commercial courts developed standardized procedures for resolving disputes between merchants from different legal traditions. Professional associations emerged to maintain quality standards and provide mutual support for traders operating in foreign markets. These developments represented more than just practical solutions to commercial problems. They reflected a growing sophistication in thinking about economic systems as integrated wholes rather than collections of individual transactions. Ancient economists, though they would not have recognized that term, began developing theories about how monetary systems functioned, what caused prices to fluctuate, and how different economic policies affected overall prosperity. The temple archives of Mesopotamia contain some of humanity's earliest economic analysis, with scribes tracking price movements over decades and attempting to identify patterns that might guide future decision-making. Greek philosophers began incorporating economic questions into their broader inquiries about justice, virtue, and the good society. Chinese administrators developed sophisticated theories about the relationship between currency supply and economic stability. Thus, early economic thinkers grappled with questions that remain central to economic theory today. What determines the value of money? How should societies balance the efficiency of market exchange against other social values? What obligations do communities have to protect individuals from economic hardship? How can economic systems be designed to promote both prosperity and justice? Their answers varied widely, reflecting different cultural values and practical experiences. But their willingness to think systematically about these questions established economic inquiry as a legitimate field of human investigation. The emergence of money had created not just new tools for exchange, but new ways of understanding human society and individual behavior. The philosophical implications of monetary exchange proved as revolutionary as the practical ones. Money forced people to confront fundamental questions about the nature of value, the basis of social cooperation, and the relationship between individual desire and collective welfare. If anything could be bought, if value could be precisely and sold, what distinguished sacred from prof measured? How should societies think about things that seemed priceless? These questions became particularly acute as monetary systems began to penetrate areas of life that had previously been governed by custom, kinship, and religious obligation. Marriage arrangements that had once been matters of family alliance began to involve explicit financial calculations. Religious offerings that had once been expressions of devotion became standardized payments. Even justice began to be quantified, with legal codes specifying precise monetary penalties for different crimes. The resistance to these changes reveals how profoundly money was altering social relationships. In many societies, certain transactions were explicitly forbidden or heavily regulated. Land, considered the foundation of community identity, often could not be sold freely. Certain crafts or professions were restricted to particular families or castes, preventing their full commodification. Religious authorities maintained spheres of activity where monetary calculation was considered inappropriate or sacrilegious. These restrictions reflected not just conservative resistance to change, but genuine concerns about the social consequences of unlimited commodification. Communities that had maintained themselves through networks of reciprocal obligation worried that monetary exchange would erode the bonds of mutual responsibility that held them together. Leaders who derived authority from traditional sources feared that economic power might challenge established hierarchies. The tension between monetary innovation and social stability would become a recurring theme throughout economic history. Each advance in monetary sophistication created new opportunities for prosperity and coordination, but also new risks of inequality and social disruption. The societies that navigated these challenges most successfully were often those that found ways to harness the benefits of monetary exchange while preserving the social institutions that provided meaning and security beyond economic calculation. As we trace these early experiments in currency and exchange, we see our ancestors wrestling with dilemmas that feel remarkably contemporary. How do we maintain human relationships in an increasingly quantified world? How do we balance efficiency against equity? How do we preserve social cohesion while embracing economic innovation? How do we manage the power that comes with controlling monetary systems? The solutions they developed were partial and temporary, adapted to their specific circumstances and cultural values. But their willingness to experiment, to adapt, to learn from both successes and failures, established patterns of monetary innovation that continue to shape our world today. Every credit card transaction, every digital payment, Every central bank decision carries forward the legacy of those first bold steps toward abstraction and trust. The story of early money is ultimately the story of humanity's growing confidence in its ability to create and maintain complex social institutions. It represents our willingness to believe in shared fictions, to trust in systems larger than ourselves, to participate in collective endeavors whose benefits extend far beyond individual gain. In learning to value abstract tokens, our ancestors learned to value abstract ideas. In trusting monetary systems, they learned to trust in the possibility of cooperation between strangers. These lessons, encoded in metal and law, in custom and institution, continue to inform our approach to economic challenges today. As we grapple with digital currencies, global financial integration, and the social consequences of economic inequality, we are drawing on insights first developed by ancient merchants, scribes, and rulers who dared to imagine that value could be more than what met the eye. The revolution they began is far from complete. Each generation must rediscover the delicate balance between monetary efficiency and social welfare, between economic innovation and cultural preservation, between individual freedom and collective responsibility. The tools they created were powerful, but like all powerful tools, they required wisdom in their application. The story of money is also the story of humanity's ongoing effort to develop that wisdom. The wisdom our ancestors sought became more urgent as their monetary innovations began to reveal unintended consequences. In the great cities of the ancient world, where coins flowed like rivers through markets and temples, a new class of people emerged who understood money not as a tool for obtaining goods, but as a commodity in itself. These were the world's first financiers, and their rise would transform the very meaning of wealth. Consider the money changer's booth in ancient Athens, nestled between the vendors of olive oil and pottery in the bustling agora. Here sat men who possessed an almost mystical knowledge of the relative values of dozens of different currencies. They could tell at a glance whether a Persian derrick was genuine silver or clever forgery. They knew which city-states had recently debased their coinage and which maintained strict standards. Most importantly, they understood that money itself could be bought and sold, that currency from one region might be worth more or less than its stated value, depending on supply, demand, and the political fortunes of distant kingdoms. This knowledge was power, and power created opportunity. A clever money changer might accept Corinthian silver at a slight discount, knowing that a merchant ship was expected from the west within days, bringing traders eager to exchange their foreign coins for local currency. The changer could then sell the same silver at a premium, profiting not from any productive labor, but from superior information and timing. Such practices introduced a new dimension to economic life that earlier societies had never confronted. Value was no longer just a matter of comparing the utility of different goods. It had become temporal, shifting with circumstances and expectations. A coin might be worth more today than tomorrow, or vice versa, depending on factors that had nothing to do with the metal from which it was made. The implications rippled through society in ways both subtle and profound. Farmers who once sold their grain immediately after harvest began to calculate whether holding their crop might yield better prices in lean months. Craftsmen started timing their production to coincide with seasonal demand patterns. Merchants began to think not just about what goods to carry, but when to buy and when to sell the currencies they needed for international trade. This temporal dimension of value created opportunities for those with capital to spare, but it also created new vulnerabilities for those living closer to subsistence. A poor family that needed to buy grain during a harsh winter might find themselves paying premium prices, not just for the grain itself, but for the coins needed to purchase it. The wealthy, who could afford to hold reserves of both goods and currency, could profit from these fluctuations, while the poor suffered from them. Ancient societies struggled to develop institutions that could manage these new forms of inequality. Some cities established public granaries that released stored grain at fixed prices during times of scarcity. Others passed laws regulating currency exchange rates or prohibiting certain forms of speculation. Religious authorities denounced the practice of charging interest on loans as morally corrupting, arguing that money should facilitate exchange rather than generate profit in itself. Yet the economic logic of these financial innovations proved difficult to resist. Temples that had once simply stored grain and valuables for their communities found themselves drawn into more sophisticated practices. They began lending stored resources to farmers for planting, to merchants for trading expeditions, to craftsmen for purchasing raw materials. The interest charged on these loans was initially modest, justified as compensation for the risk of default and the administrative costs of record keeping. But gradually, these temple banks discovered that lending money could be more profitable than any other economic activity. A successful loan might return 30% more value than the original principal, far exceeding what could be earned through farming, crafting, or trading. The institutions that had been created to serve their communities began to see lending as their primary function, with their original religious and social purposes becoming secondary. This transformation reflected a broader shift in how societies thought about wealth and its purposes. In earlier times, prosperity had been understood primarily in terms of abundance and security. A wealthy person was someone who had enough food, clothing, and shelter to weather any crisis, with surplus to share with family and community. Wealth was static, measured in possessions and stored resources. The rise of financial institutions introduced a dynamic understanding of wealth that emphasized growth and return on investment. Money was no longer something to be stored, but something to be deployed. Capital was not a destination, but a starting point. The wealthy began to be distinguished not by what they owned, but by their ability to make their assets generate additional value over time. This shift created new social tensions between those who controlled capital and those who depended on their own labor for survival. A farmer who borrowed seed grain from a temple bank might find that a poor harvest left him unable to repay the loan with interest. The temple might then claim his land as collateral, transforming him from an independent cultivator into a tenant or laborer. Over time, productive assets could become concentrated in the hands of financial institutions, while their original owners became dependent workers. Ancient law codes reveal the seriousness with which societies took these problems. The laws of Hammurabi included detailed provisions regulating debt relationships, limiting the amount of interest that could be charged, and protecting debtors from losing their freedom or their family's freedom due to financial obligations. The Hebrew Bible's Jubilee laws called for the periodic cancellation of debts and the return of land to its original owners, recognizing that without such interventions, financial relationships could create permanent class divisions. These legal protections reflected a deeper understanding that monetary systems, for all their benefits, carried inherent risks to social cohesion. The same mechanisms that enabled efficient exchange and productive investment could also create cycles of debt and dependency that undermined the independence and dignity of ordinary citizens. The challenge was to harness the benefits of financial innovation while preventing its most destructive consequences. Some societies experimented with alternative approaches to these challenges. In certain Greek city-states, wealthy citizens were expected to use their resources for public benefit through a system called liturgy, funding festivals, maintaining public buildings, or equipping military forces. This institutionalized philanthropy served both to redistribute wealth and to maintain the social legitimacy of economic inequality by ensuring that prosperity served communal purposes. Other communities developed more radical solutions. Some early Christian communities practiced forms of economic sharing that eliminated private property entirely, pooling resources according to need rather than contribution. Certain monastic communities maintained this practice for centuries, demonstrating that alternative economic arrangements were possible even if they remained limited to small, highly committed groups. But for most ancient societies, the path forward lay not in abandoning monetary systems, but in developing better ways to regulate and channel them. This required new forms of expertise and new institutions of governance. Professional administrators emerged who specialized in managing public finances, regulating markets, and overseeing banking activities. Commercial courts developed sophisticated procedures for resolving financial disputes and enforcing contractual obligations. The complexity of these emerging systems demanded new forms of record-keeping and analysis. Temple archives began maintaining detailed accounts not just of their own transactions, but of broader economic patterns within their communities. They tracked seasonal price movements, monitored debt levels, and attempted to identify early warning signs of economic distress that might threaten social stability. These early economic administrators were developing what we might recognize as primitive forms of economic policy. They understood that the money supply needed to be carefully managed. Too little currency could stifle trade and economic growth, while too much could lead to inflation and economic instability. They recognized that credit markets needed regulation to prevent exploitation while still allowing productive investment. They saw that international trade required diplomatic cooperation to maintain stable exchange rates and prevent currency manipulation. The insights thus ancient economists developed through practical experience would later be systematized into formal economic theory, but their fundamental observations about the relationship between money, credit, and social welfare remain relevant today. They understood that economic systems are not neutral tools, but powerful forces that shape social relationships and distribute opportunities. They recognized that the benefits of monetary innovation come with costs that must be carefully managed if societies are to remain stable and just. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that economic systems are human creations that can be modified and improved through conscious effort. The monetary institutions they inherited were not immutable laws of nature, but contingent arrangements that could be reformed when they no longer served human needs. This recognition of human agency in economic affairs would prove crucial as societies faced the challenges of growing complexity and scale. The expansion of trade networks created pressures for further monetary innovation that would test these emerging regulatory frameworks. As merchants began operating across multiple political jurisdictions, they encountered new challenges that existing institutions were poorly equipped to handle. A trader might borrow money in one city, invest it in goods from a second region, and sell those goods in a third territory, all while navigating different legal systems, currency standards, and commercial customs. These cross-border transactions required new forms of financial instrument that could transfer value across space and time while minimizing risk and transaction costs. The solutions that emerged would represent another leap in monetary abstraction, moving beyond physical currency toward the promise-based systems that would eventually evolve into modern banking and credit. In the counting houses of ancient Babylon, scribes began experimenting with documents that represented not actual money, but claims on money stored elsewhere. A merchant traveling from Babylon to distant Harappa might deposit silver with a trusted institution and receive a clay tablet inscribed with symbols certifying his claim. Upon reaching his destination, he could present this tablet to a corresponding institution and receive local currency in exchange, avoiding the risks and costs of transporting valuable metals across dangerous routes. These early credit instruments required unprecedented levels of trust and institutional cooperation. The organizations issuing such documents had to maintain reliable communications across vast distances, establish consistent standards for verification and authentication, and develop procedures for handling disputes and defaults. They were creating the first international financial networks, built not on political authority, but on commercial reputation and mutual benefit. The success of these systems depended on something even more abstract than the metals from which coins were made. They required trust in institutions, confidence in procedures, and faith in the reliability of distant partners whom the participants might never meet. A merchant accepting a credit document was betting not just on the honesty of the issuing institution, but on the stability of entire networks of commercial relationships stretching across continents. This expansion of trust beyond personal relationships and local communities represented another fundamental shift in human social organization. For the first time, economic cooperation could extend beyond the reach of kinship, political authority, or religious affiliation. Commercial networks began to create their own forms of social cohesion, binding together people who shared no common culture except their participation in trade. The implications extended far beyond economics. These commercial relationships became conduits for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. A merchant who trusted a foreign partner enough to engage in complex financial transactions might also be receptive to their religious beliefs, artistic traditions, or philosophical insights. Trade networks became vectors for cultural diffusion, spreading innovations and perspectives across civilizations. Yet this expansion of trust also created new vulnerabilities. Economic relationships that had once been embedded in broader social contexts became increasingly autonomous and specialized. A merchant's reputation in commercial circles might have little connection to their standing in their home community. Financial success might not translate into social respect or political influence. The values that governed marketplace interactions might conflict with those that maintained family and community relationships. These tensions became particularly acute as commercial networks grew large enough to influence political decisions. Wealthy merchants began to lobby for policies that favored trade over other economic activities. They pushed for standardized weights and measures, improved roads and harbors, and diplomatic agreements that protected commercial interests. Their influence sometimes aligned with broader community welfare, but not always. The city-states that emerged as major commercial centers faced difficult choices about how to balance the interests of their trading communities against those of other citizens. Policies that attracted international commerce might also increase inequality, environmental degradation, or cultural disruption. The benefits of economic growth had to be weighed against their social and political costs. Some societies developed innovative approaches to these challenges. The Phoenician cities became wealthy through trade, while maintaining strong communal institutions that ensured broad participation in prosperity. Greek colonies established democratic institutions that gave citizens a voice in economic policy decisions. Roman law developed sophisticated frameworks for regulating commercial relationships while protecting traditional social values. But the fundamental tension between economic efficiency and social cohesion would remain a persistent challenge as monetary systems continued to evolve. Each innovation that made trade faster, cheaper, or more profitable also tended to make economic relationships more impersonal, specialized, and divorced from other forms of human connection. The price of economic progress was often the erosion of traditional sources of meaning and community. The ancient world's response to these challenges would establish patterns that continue to influence economic development today. The institutions they created to manage money and credit, the laws they developed to regulate commercial relationships, and the philosophical frameworks they used to think about economic justice all contributed to humanity's ongoing effort to harness the power of monetary systems while preserving the social bonds that give life meaning beyond material prosperity. As we follow this story forward, we see our ancestors grappling with questions that feel remarkably contemporary. How do we maintain local community in an increasingly globalized economy? How do we ensure that the benefits of economic growth are shared broadly rather than concentrated among the few? How do we preserve cultural values and social institutions while adapting to technological change? How do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility in complex economic systems? The answers they developed were imperfect and incomplete, adapted to their specific circumstances and limited by their available tools. But their willingness to experiment, their recognition that economic systems could be reformed and improved, and their understanding that material prosperity must be balanced against other human values, established foundations that we continue to build upon today. The revolution in human cooperation that began with the first standardized currencies was far from complete. Each generation would face new challenges as monetary systems became more sophisticated and far-reaching. But the basic insight that our ancestors discovered, that abstract symbols could embody concrete trust, that social cooperation could be extended through shared fictions, that economic systems were human creations subject to human modification, would prove to be one of their most enduring and influential legacies. The innovations spreading from these commercial centers would face their greatest test not in times of prosperity, but in moments of crisis. When drought struck the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia around 4,000 years ago, the sophisticated credit networks that had enabled unprecedented economic growth suddenly became channels for transmitting disaster. Farmers who had borrowed against future harvests found themselves unable to repay loans. Merchants who had invested in grain shipments watched their cargo vessels return empty. Temple banks that had seemed unshakably solid discovered that their carefully maintained reserves could evaporate with shocking speed. This crisis revealed something profound about the nature of the monetary systems our ancestors had created. Money was not just a neutral tool for facilitating exchange, but a form of social relationship that could amplify both prosperity and disaster. When times were good, credit networks allowed surpluses to flow efficiently to where they were most needed, multiplying the benefits of favorable conditions. But when times turned harsh, those same networks could transmit shortages and failures across vast distances, turning local problems into regional catastrophes. The psychological impact was perhaps even more severe than the material losses. People who had grown accustomed to the predictability of monetary exchange suddenly found themselves confronting the reality that their carefully accumulated wealth could disappear through forces entirely beyond their control. A merchant's lifetime of successful trading could be wiped out by a drought in a distant land. A craftsman's savings could become worthless if the political authority that guaranteed their currency collapsed. These experiences forced ancient societies to develop new ways of thinking about risk and security. Some communities began maintaining larger reserves as insurance against uncertainty. Others diversified their economic activities to reduce dependence on any single source of prosperity. Still others developed more sophisticated forms of risk sharing, creating institutions that could absorb individual losses while maintaining overall stability. The temple complexes of ancient Sumer pioneered some of humanity's earliest insurance systems, pooling resources from multiple communities to provide assistance during crop failures or natural disasters. These arrangements required careful calculation of probabilities and contributions, demanding mathematical sophistication that pushed the boundaries of existing knowledge. Scribes developed new techniques for record keeping and analysis, creating some of our earliest examples of statistical thinking. But the most important innovation was conceptual rather than technical. Ancient societies began to understand that economic security could not be achieved through individual accumulation alone, but required collective institutions designed to manage shared risks. This insight would prove crucial as monetary systems continued to evolve and become more complex. The development of these risk management institutions also revealed the limits of purely local solutions to economic problems. When disasters struck entire regions simultaneously, even the most well-prepared communities might find their resources insufficient. The interconnection that had made prosperity possible also made isolation impossible. Local communities found themselves dependent on the stability of networks they could influence but not control. This dependence created new forms of political pressure and diplomatic necessity. Cities that had once maintained their independence through military strength now found that their survival depended on maintaining good relationships with trading partners and financial institutions. Economic considerations began to shape political decisions in ways that previous generations would have found incomprehensible. The emergence of these economic constraints on political action represented another fundamental shift in human social organization. Where rulers had once been limited primarily by military considerations and traditional obligations, they now had to account for the reactions of merchants, the stability of currency systems, and the confidence of international trading networks. Economic power was becoming a form of political power, and political decisions were increasingly subject to economic logic. Some societies resisted these trends, attempting to maintain traditional forms of authority and social organization despite the pressures of monetary integration. Others embraced them, restructuring their institutions to maximize their advantages in an increasingly connected world. The choices they made would determine not just their immediate prosperity, but their long-term survival and influence. The kingdoms that proved most successful at navigating these challenges were often those that developed sophisticated understanding of the relationship between monetary policy and political stability. They recognized that currency was not just a tool for facilitating trade, but an instrument of statecraft that could be used to project power, reward allies, and punish enemies. The Persian Empire, which at its height controlled territory from India to Greece, developed perhaps the most advanced monetary system of the ancient world. The Persian daric became a trusted currency across vast regions, not just because of its consistent weight and purity, but because of the administrative sophistication that backed it. Persian officials maintained detailed records of regional economic conditions, adjusted tax policies to account for local circumstances, and used currency distribution as a tool for managing political relationships. This integration of monetary and political authority created new possibilities for large-scale coordination and control. The Persian kings could finance massive construction projects by drawing on resources from across their empire, coordinating the efforts of millions of workers through carefully managed systems of payment and reward. They could respond to regional crises by redirecting resources from prosperous areas to those in need, maintaining overall stability, even when individual provinces faced severe challenges. But this same integration also created new vulnerabilities. The Persian monetary system depended on maintaining confidence in imperial authority across vast distances and diverse populations. When military defeats or succession disputes weakened central control, the effects rippled through the entire economic system. Merchants began hoarding valuable currencies while disposing of questionable ones. Regional officials started asserting greater autonomy over local resources. The network effects that had amplified imperial power during times of strength became mechanisms for transmitting weakness and instability. The eventual fragmentation of the Persian Empire demonstrated both the power and the fragility of monetary systems based on political authority. When Alexander of Macedon conquered Persian territories, He inherited not just land and people, but an entire economic infrastructure built around Persian currency and administrative practices. His success depended partly on his ability to maintain confidence in these systems while gradually adapting them to serve his own purposes. Alexander's approach to monetary conquest revealed sophisticated understanding of the relationship between economic and political power. Rather than immediately replacing Persian currency with Macedonian alternatives, he initially maintained existing systems while gradually introducing his own symbols and standards. This allowed him to benefit from established networks while slowly shifting their orientation toward his new imperial vision. The coins minted during Alexander's campaigns tell the story of this gradual transition. Early issues maintained Persian weights and designs while adding small Macedonian symbols. Later coins featured Alexander's portrait, but preserved Persian metallic content and quality standards. Only after his authority was firmly established did the currency become distinctively Macedonian in both form and substance. This careful management of monetary transition reflected deeper insights about the nature of economic power. Alexander understood that currency systems embodied trust relationships that could not be changed overnight without destroying the very networks he sought to control. The value of money depended not just on the metal from which it was made, but on the confidence of those who used it. Maintaining that confidence required respecting existing expectations while gradually reshaping them. The success of Alexander's monetary policies contributed to the creation of one of history's most extensive trade networks, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Greek currency became accepted in markets from Egypt to Afghanistan, not because of military compulsion alone, but because merchants found it reliable and convenient. The economic integration that followed Alexander's conquests outlasted his political empire by centuries, creating cultural and commercial connections that continued to shape the ancient world long after his death. Yet this expansion also revealed the limits of currency systems based on individual authority. When Alexander died without a clear successor, his empire fragmented into competing kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy while undermining the others. The monetary unity that had facilitated trade across vast territories gave way to a confusing patchwork of competing currencies, each backed by different political authorities with varying degrees of stability and trustworthiness. The merchants and financiers who had thrived under unified monetary standards suddenly found themselves navigating a complex landscape of exchange rates, political risks, and uncertain values. Some adapted by developing new forms of expertise in currency evaluation and risk management. Others retreated to more conservative strategies, limiting their activities to regions with stable monetary systems. The fragmentation of political authority created new opportunities for some, while destroying the foundations of prosperity for others. This period of monetary chaos stimulated innovation in financial instruments and institutions. Merchants developed more sophisticated forms of credit that could function across multiple political jurisdictions. Banking houses established networks of correspondence that could facilitate trade, even when official diplomatic relationships were strained. Professional money changers created informal systems for stabilizing exchange rates and managing currency risks. These innovations represented another step in the evolution of monetary systems from political instruments toward more autonomous economic institutions. The networks of trust and cooperation that emerged during this period operated according to commercial rather than political logic, creating forms of economic integration that could survive political fragmentation and conflict. The rise of these autonomous financial networks also created new forms of economic power that operated independently of traditional political authority. Wealthy banking families accumulated influence that rivaled that of kings and generals. Commercial cities developed their own diplomatic relationships that sometimes conflicted with the policies of their nominal rulers. Economic considerations began to shape political decisions in ways that challenged traditional concepts of sovereignty and loyalty. The tension between political and economic authority would become a recurring theme throughout subsequent history as societies struggled to balance the benefits of autonomous market institutions against the need for democratic accountability and social cohesion. The solutions developed during this period established precedents that continue to influence debates about financial regulation, international trade, and economic governance today. As we trace these developments, we see our ancestors continuing to grapple with fundamental questions about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare, between efficiency and equity, between local autonomy and global integration. Their experiments with monetary systems were also experiments in social organization, testing different approaches to the age-old challenge of enabling cooperation among strangers while maintaining the bonds of community that give life meaning beyond material accumulation. The lessons they learned through trial and error, success and failure, would become part of humanity's accumulated wisdom about the possibilities and dangers of monetary systems. Each generation would face new challenges as technology and scale created new opportunities and new risks. But the basic insights about trust, value, and social cooperation that emerged from these early experiments would remain relevant across millennia of subsequent development. The story of money's early evolution is ultimately the story of humanity's growing sophistication in creating and maintaining complex social institutions. It reflects our species' remarkable ability to believe in shared abstractions, to cooperate across vast distances and cultural differences, to develop systems of mutual benefit that transcend immediate self-interest. These capabilities, first tested in ancient marketplaces and temple complexes, would prove essential as human societies continued to grow in size and complexity. And so we arrive at the end of this long journey through deep time, from the first tentative exchanges between small bands of hunter-gatherers to the sophisticated financial networks that bound together the ancient world. What we have traced is not merely the history of money, but the story of how our ancestors learned to trust in abstractions, to believe in shared fictions that became more powerful than physical reality itself. Every coin you handle today, every digital transaction you make, carries within it the accumulated wisdom and hard-won insights of thousands of generations. The merchant counting silver in ancient Babylon, the temple scribe tracking grain loans in Mesopotamia, the Persian administrator managing currency across vast territories. All of them contributed threads to the complex tapestry of economic understanding that we inherit today. Their experiments taught us that money is not a thing, but a relationship, Not a commodity, but a language. Not a tool of individual accumulation, but a mechanism of social cooperation that allows strangers to trust one another across vast distances of space and time. The true revolution was not in the metal from which coins were made, but in the collective imagination that gave them meaning. As you drift towards sleep tonight or return to your daily tasks, carry with you this recognition that every economic transaction is an act of faith, every monetary system a testament to humanity's remarkable capacity for cooperation. The story of money is the story of our species learning to believe in tomorrow, to trust in the possibility that our shared fictions could become foundations for genuine prosperity and human flourishing. The first money was not gold or silver, but trust itself. And in that trust, our ancestors built the foundation for everything that would follow. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of our economic origins. Until we meet again in the next story, stay curious, stay calm.